At the height of America's Gilded Age, before outrage, before antitrust trials, before the word monopoly became a national accusation, the Rockefeller name inspired something far more unsettling than hatred. It inspired unease. Not because the family flaunted its wealth, but because it didn't. While other dynasties announced their arrival with marble staircases and ballroom ceilings, the Rockefellers built quietly, deliberately, and at a scale that suggested permanence rather than celebration. Their mansions were not invitations. They were statements. And long before America turned against them, Americans sensed that something about this dynasty was different. John D. Rockefeller did not rise as a social figure. He rose as a system. By the late 19th century, Standard Oil was not merely a company, it was an invisible architecture shaping prices, labor, transportation, and politics. Rockefeller wealth did not sparkle. It suffocated. It was everywhere and nowhere at once. And when that kind of power finally materialized in stone, it did not take the form of palaces meant to dazzle the public eye. It took the form of estates designed to withdraw from it. This is where the story truly begins, not with hatred, but with fear disguised as respect. The Rockefeller mansions emerged during a moment when America still believed wealth was proof of virtue. Industry was framed as progress, and success was treated as moral validation. Yet even in that climate, Rockefeller wealth felt excessive in a way others did not. Vanderbilt mansions were extravagant but theatrical. Hearst castles were obsessive but personal. Rockefeller estates were restrained, fortified, and strategic. They reflected a man who did not seek admiration, only control. Kykute, the family's most famous estate in Pocantico Hills, New York, was built not to impress society but to escape it. High above the Hudson Valley, hidden from city streets and public scrutiny, it functioned less like a home and more like a command center. Its very location sent a message. Power did not need proximity. It did not need applause. It only needed insulation. To the public, this withdrawal was unsettling. In an era obsessed with spectacle, the Rockefellers refused to perform. They did not host legendary parties. They did not cultivate myths of glamour. They lived behind gates while their influence shaped daily life for millions who would never see the inside of those walls. The mansions became symbols not of success but of distance. Journalists of the time noticed this. Politicians noticed it. Workers felt it. The Rockefeller empire touched everything from kerosene lamps to railroad freight rates, yet its architects remained unreachable. That imbalance planted the first seeds of resentment. People did not hate what they could not see. They feared it. What made this fear potent was Rockefeller's moral posture. John D. Rockefeller spoke publicly about humility, restraint, and Christian duty. He avoided indulgence and condemned waste. But this rhetoric clashed sharply with the reality of his holdings. When a man who owned vast swaths of the economy preached modesty from behind stone walls, the contradiction became impossible to ignore. The mansions, though architecturally conservative, grew larger over time. Not louder, but heavier. More land, more security, more separation. They expanded the way Standard Oil expanded, methodically, invisibly, relentlessly. And just like the corporation, they did so without asking permission. By the early 1900s, something subtle had shifted. The American public still admired success, but it no longer trusted concentration. The scale of Rockefeller wealth no longer felt accidental or earned. It felt engineered. And the mansions were physical proof that this wealth was not meant to circulate. It was meant to endure. This is the critical distinction that separates the Rockefellers from other dynasties. Their homes were not monuments to joy or lineage. They were infrastructure, built to last beyond public favor, built to outlive criticism, built with the same logic that crushed competitors and absorbed markets. America sensed this long before it could articulate it. When people looked at Rockefeller estates, they did not see dreams fulfilled. They saw doors closed. They saw landscapes carefully managed, access tightly controlled, lives lived beyond accountability. The mansions did not invite aspiration. They reminded the nation of its limits. And so, Before America turned on the Rockefellers, before investigative exposes and labor violence and Supreme Court rulings, something deeper occurred. Trust eroded. Admiration curdled into suspicion. Respect hardened into resentment. The Rockefeller mansions did not cause that shift, but they made it visible. They stood as quiet proof that power in America had changed form. It no longer needed crowns or castles or titles. It lived behind hedges, spoke through corporations, and justified itself through restraint. This is the foundation of the story. Not outrage, but unease. Not rebellion, but realization. Because once Americans understood what those mansions truly represented, turning away from them became inevitable. Standard Oil did not merely fund the Rockefeller mansions. It shaped them. Every wall, every corridor, every acre of land reflected the same philosophy that allowed one company to dominate an entire nation's energy supply. Section 2 begins not inside the house, but inside the system that made the house possible, a system built on consolidation, efficiency, and the elimination of vulnerability. John D. Rockefeller believed disorder was weakness. From the earliest days of Standard Oil, he structured his empire to remove unpredictability at every level. He absorbed competitors not out of vanity, but to eliminate variables. He negotiated secret railroad rebates, crushed price wars through patience rather than spectacle, and centralized decision-making so thoroughly that entire regions of the country moved according to policies drafted in quiet offices far from public view. This was not entrepreneurial flamboyance. It was industrial discipline. That same discipline appears unmistakably in the architecture of Rockefeller estates. Unlike the flamboyant mansions of the Vanderbilts or Astors, Rockefeller homes were intentionally restrained. Kekut, the most emblematic, was solid rather than ornate, elevated rather than exposed, symmetrical rather than indulgent. Its design communicated authority without warmth. The message was clear. This was not a place of social conquest. It was a place of command. Standard Oil's influence extended beyond profits. It controlled refineries, pipelines, rail contracts, and pricing structures. Its reach was so comprehensive that Americans depended on Rockefeller infrastructure without ever consenting to it. This invisible dominance created a paradox. Rockefeller wealth felt omnipresent, yet its source felt inaccessible. The mansions made that paradox tangible. They were the only visible manifestation of an empire otherwise experienced through economic pressure. Inside these estates, privacy was absolute. Not for luxury, but for insulation. The Rockefellers did not entertain broadly. They did not open their homes to society. Unlike other Gilded Age dynasties that sought validation through social acceptance, the Rockefellers built inward. This inwardness mirrored Standard Oil's corporate culture. Information flowed upward, authority flowed downward, and accountability rarely flowed outward. The architecture reinforced hierarchy. Living quarters were clearly separated from service areas. Movement was controlled. Visibility was limited. These were not accidental choices. They reflected a worldview in which efficiency required boundaries and power required distance. As Standard Oil expanded, public criticism followed. Independent refiners were pushed out. Small businesses collapsed. Railroad favoritism became public knowledge. But Rockefeller responded not with confrontation but with silence. He rarely appeared in public defense of his practices. Instead, he retreated further into private spaces, allowing the system to speak for itself. The mansions became physical extensions of that strategy. When pressure mounted, Rockefeller did not retreat to modest homes or blend into anonymity. He retreated upward into estates that placed literal elevation between himself and the consequences of his business decisions. This withdrawal had consequences to the American public. These estates began to resemble fortifications rather than homes. Their very discretion felt calculated. The absence of extravagance did not read as humility. It read as concealment. People sensed that behind those walls, decisions were being made that affected lives far beyond the estate grounds. The more Standard Oil was criticized, the more the mansions appeared complicit. They were funded by profits generated through market domination, labor suppression, and legal maneuvering. They stood as monuments not to innovation, but to consolidation. And yet, Rockefeller himself framed his actions as moral necessity. He believed chaos was sinful. Waste was immoral. Competition, in his view, was inefficient and therefore harmful. Standard Oil, like his estates, existed to impose order on a disorderly world. This belief system explains why Rockefeller mansions lack warmth. They were not built to host joy. They were built to sustain control. Comfort existed, but it was secondary to function. Beauty existed, but it was disciplined. As antitrust sentiment grew, this distinction became critical. Americans were not reacting to wealth alone. They were reacting to a philosophy that treated society as something to be managed rather than engaged. The mansions embodied that philosophy. They did not celebrate American ideals of openness and mobility. They contradicted them. They stood apart from the communities that made Rockefeller wealth possible, reinforcing the idea that power had withdrawn from public accountability. By the time the federal government began dismantling Standard Oil in 1911, the damage to Rockefeller's public image was already done. The breakup confirmed what many Americans had suspected, that no private entity should be allowed to operate at such scale. Insulated from consequence, the mansions, once symbols of success, became reminders of excess. Not visual excess, but moral excess. They represented a concentration of power that no longer aligned with democratic values. What makes this moment pivotal is that Rockefeller did not adjust his domestic architecture in response. There was no opening of gates, no symbolic gesture of accessibility. Instead, the estates remained closed, unchanged, and quietly fortified. This rigidity reinforced public resentment. It suggested that even when challenged, Rockefeller power did not bend. It simply restructured. Standard Oil may have been broken up, but the wealth remained. The estates remained. And the philosophy that built them remained embedded in their walls. Section 2 ends with this realization. America did not turn on the Rockefeller mansions because they were grand. It turned on them because they revealed how wealth had been reorganized away from participation toward permanence. The houses were not celebrations of success. They were evidence of control perfected. And once Americans recognized that, admiration was no longer possible. By the time America began to question Rockefeller wealth openly, something deeper than economic imbalance was already underway. Section 3 marks the moment when admiration fractured, when success itself became suspect, and when the nation began to ask whether unlimited wealth could coexist with democratic ideals. This shift did not happen overnight. It unfolded slowly through headlines, courtrooms, and kitchen table conversations, until the Rockefeller name stopped representing progress and started representing threat. For much of the 19th century, American culture celebrated accumulation. Wealth was framed as proof of ingenuity, discipline, and divine favor. Industrialists were treated as architects of national destiny. But the scale of Rockefeller wealth strained that narrative. Standard Oil did not merely succeed. It absorbed. It did not compete. It eliminated. And as its dominance became impossible to ignore, Americans began to feel less like beneficiaries of progress and more like subjects of a system they did not control. This is where wealth stopped being admirable. The turning point came with visibility. Investigative journalism pierced the silence that had shielded Rockefeller operations. Ida Tarbell's expose of Standard Oil did more than document unfair practices. It dismantled the myth that Rockefeller's success was accidental or benign. Her writing revealed a carefully engineered monopoly that thrived by suffocating competition and manipulating markets. For the first time, the public could trace the connection between their daily expenses and the decisions made behind closed doors. The impact was seismic. Rockefeller wealth was no longer abstract. It had fingerprints. As this awareness spread, public perception of Rockefeller mansions changed dramatically. These estates were no longer seen as distant symbols of achievement. They were reinterpreted as repositories of extracted value. Every stone began to feel paid for by someone else's loss. Every acre represented a competitor crushed, a worker underpaid, a community subordinated. This psychological shift mattered more than any legal ruling. The antitrust case against Standard Oil would come later. Public judgment had already been passed. The progressive era reframed the moral landscape of American wealth. Reformers argued that unchecked accumulation distorted democracy, concentrated power, and eroded social trust. For the first time, restraint was no longer a private virtue. It became a public expectation. Wealth was no longer just something to be earned. It was something to be justified. The Rockefellers failed this test not because they were wealthy, but because they were inaccessible. Their mansions, designed to retreat from public life, now read as evasive. Silence, once interpreted as modesty, felt like avoidance. The absence of spectacle did not suggest humility. It suggested insulation. Americans wanted accountability, and what they saw instead were wars. Other Gilded Age families attempted to counter rising resentment by leaning into visibility. They hosted events, funded civic projects, and cultivated public narratives of generosity. The Rockefellers did not. They doubled down on privacy. Their homes remained closed, their movements limited, their public appearances minimal. This refusal to perform contrition hardened public sentiment. Rockefeller wealth felt unresponsive, immovable, and therefore illegitimate. As trust eroded, the mansions became focal points of anger. They were fixed, visible, and symbolic. You could not confront a corporation. You could confront a house. And so, Rockefeller estates became shorthand for everything Americans resented about concentrated wealth. Newspapers published photographs and descriptions of these properties, not to admire their beauty, but to contextualize their scale. Headlines no longer framed them as accomplishments. They framed them as evidence. This change marked a profound cultural rupture. America had always tolerated inequality as long as it believed in mobility. But Rockefeller wealth suggested a closed system. The mansions did not look temporary. They looked permanent. They implied a future in which power would remain inherited, insulated, and unchallengeable. That implication terrified a nation founded on rejection of aristocracy. The idea that America was becoming what it had once opposed fueled reform movements and political backlash. Trusting was not just economic policy. It was cultural self-defense. The Rockefeller mansions stood in opposition to the American myth of openness, embodying a form of modern aristocracy that had no intention of engaging with the public. Even Rockefeller's philanthropy, which expanded significantly during this period, failed to repair the damage. Donations to universities, churches, and medical research were framed as calculated, reactive, and insufficient. Charity, in this context, did not soften resentment. It confirmed imbalance. It reminded the public how much power was being redistributed at one family's discretion. The mansions amplified this perception. They suggested that while money might flow outward, control remained inward. Decisions were still being made privately, far from democratic oversight. By the early 20th century, Rockefeller estates had become symbols of a moral crisis. They were no longer admired as achievements. They were questioned as anomalies. Why should one family live beyond accountability while shaping the nation's economic reality? This question reshaped American attitudes toward wealth permanently. What makes Section 3 essential is that it explains why Rockefeller mansions could never recover their public image. Once admiration turns into suspicion, architecture cannot redeem it. No renovation can soften moral doubt. The houses had become fixed in the public imagination as artifacts of a broken system. Even after the breakup of Standard Oil, the suspicion remained. The wealth endured. The estates endured. And so did the belief that they represented something fundamentally un-American. This is the moment. America turned not in anger yet, but in belief. The belief that some wealth was no longer compatible with the values the nation claimed to hold. And once that belief took root, the fate of the Rockefeller mansions was sealed. By 1914, America's discomfort with Rockefeller power had already hardened into suspicion. But Section 4 marks the moment when suspicion turned into moral outrage. This is the point of no return. Not because of architecture, not because of monopolies, but because blood entered the story. The Ludlow massacre did what journalism reform movements and court cases could not. It fused Rockefeller wealth to human death in the public imagination. Permanently and irrevocably, Ludlow, Colorado was not a place of grandeur. It was a coal mining settlement, harsh and temporary, populated by immigrant laborers who lived under the absolute authority of the Colorado Fuel and Iron Company. CF&I was controlled by the Rockefeller family. Though the Rockefellers themselves remained thousands of miles away, physically insulated by estates like Kykute and psychologically insulated by layers of management. To the miners, Rockefeller power was not abstract. It determined wages, housing, safety, and survival. The miners lived in company towns. They were paid in company scrip. Their homes belonged to the corporation. Their livelihoods depended on obedience. When they attempted to organize for better conditions, recognition of their union, safer mines, fair pay, they were not negotiating with a local employer. They were challenging a system designed to crush resistance. In September 1913, the miners went on strike. They were evicted from company housing and forced to live in tent colonies through the Colorado winter. These were families, not just workers, women, children, entire lives uprooted. CF&I responded not with compromise but with force. Armed guards and the Colorado National Guard were deployed, ostensibly to maintain order, but in practice to protect corporate interests. For months, tensions simmered. Then came April 20th, 1914. What happened that day shattered the remaining distance between Rockefeller wealth and public conscience. National Guardsmen and company guards attacked the Ludlow tent colony. Gunfire erupted. Tents were set ablaze. When the smoke cleared, more than 24 people were dead, including women and children who had suffocated or burned while hiding in cellars beneath their tents. America recoiled. The details were impossible to sanitize. Children found dead in pits dug for shelter. Mothers burned alive. Families erased. These were not statistics. They were bodies. And for the first time, the public could not separate Rockefeller wealth from Rockefeller responsibility. The Rockefellers had not ordered the attack. That distinction mattered legally. It did not matter morally. What enraged the nation was not just the violence but the detachment. John D. Rockefeller Jr., who oversaw the family's business interests, initially responded with statements emphasizing legality, order, and corporate authority. He spoke the language of management while the nation spoke the language of grief. This mismatch was catastrophic. For Americans already uneasy with concentrated wealth, Ludlow confirmed their worst fears. It suggested that behind the quiet walls of Rockefeller mansions existed a moral vacuum, system so insulated that it could rationalize the deaths of children as collateral damage. Newspapers exploded with outrage. Cartoons depicted Rockefeller money soaked in blood. Ministers condemned the family from pulpits. Reformers used Ludlow as proof that unchecked corporate power was not merely unfair, but lethal. And suddenly, the mansions mattered in a new way. Kykute and other Rockefeller estates became visual anchors for public anger. They were no longer symbols of distance. They were symbols of indifference. While families froze and burned in Colorado, Rockefeller heirs lived among manicured gardens and stone walls designed to endure forever. The contrast was unbearable. This is the moment when America turned on the Rockefeller mansions not as structures, but as moral statements. They embodied a system where suffering was outsourced and hidden, where consequences never reached those who benefited most. The family attempted damage control. Advisors urged Rockefeller Jr. to change tactics. He embarked on a public relations campaign, visiting mining towns, meeting workers, listening belatedly. These efforts were unprecedented, but they were also reactive. To many Americans, they felt like performance rather than accountability. Philanthropy increased. Foundations expanded. Public messaging softened. But Ludlow had altered the equation permanently. Charity could not erase the image of burned tents. Silence could not undo the perception that Rockefeller wealth had been protected at the cost of human life. The mansions, meanwhile, remained unchanged. They did not open their gates in mourning. They did not become sites of reflection or acknowledgement. They stood as they always had, private, elevated, insulated. And that stillness, once admired, now felt obscene. What Ludlow exposed was not cruelty, but structure. It revealed how distance allows violence to occur without intent. The Rockefellers did not need to be monsters for tragedy to happen. They only needed to be removed enough that consequences became abstract. This realization reshaped American attitudes toward elite estates. Mansions were no longer neutral expressions of success. They became evidence of separation. Proof that wealth could create moral blind spots so vast that human suffering became invisible. From this point forward, Rockefeller mansions could not be redeemed through aesthetics or restraint. They were indelibly associated with a system that valued order over life. No amount of architectural modesty could counteract that perception. The Ludlow massacre also transformed the national conversation about responsibility. It forced Americans to confront the reality that power exercised indirectly is still power, and that insulation does not absolve accountability. The idea that one could profit from a system without owning its consequences became intolerable. And so, the Rockefeller mansions became something else entirely. They became symbols of a dangerous modernity where decisions made in silence could devastate lives far away, where beauty could coexist with brutality, and where wealth could outlast morality. Section 4 ends with a truth that cannot be softened. America did not turn on the Rockefeller mansions because they were large or expensive. It turned on them because, after Ludlow, they represented a kind of power that could not be trusted with human life. From that moment on, the story was no longer about envy. It was about justice. And once blood enters a legacy, architecture can never cleanse it. After Ludlow, the Rockefeller response did not take the form many Americans expected. There was no dramatic retreat from wealth, no dismantling of estates, no symbolic surrender of space or power. Instead, the family moved in the opposite direction, away from visibility, away from confrontation, and deeper into controlled environments. Section 5 examines Kaycoot itself, not as a masterpiece of architecture, but as a psychological structure, a house designed to survive hostility by withdrawing from the nation that now distrusted it. Kaycoot was never meant to be loved. That distinction matters. Built high above the Hudson River Valley, removed from urban centers and shielded by vast acreage, the estate was conceived as a place of retreat rather than display. Its name, derived from the Dutch word from lookout, captures its function precisely. This was not a house that invited the public in. It was a house that watched from above. After Ludlow, that distance took on a new meaning. The American public wanted accountability, visibility, and humility. What they saw instead was insulation perfected. Kaycoot did not change. It did not open. It did not soften. And in doing so, it became the physical embodiment of everything Americans resented about Rockefeller power. The house itself was architecturally restrained, classical, solid, symmetrical, but restraint did not read as modesty in the aftermath of violence. It read as calculation. The absence of flamboyance felt intentional, even defensive. This was not a palace celebrating wealth. It was a stronghold protecting it. From Kaycoot, Rockefeller Jr. oversaw philanthropic initiatives, corporate reorganizations, and public relations strategies meant to stabilize the family standing. But this management occurred behind walls that symbolized withdrawal rather than engagement. To the public, it appeared that the Rockefellers were managing outrage rather than confronting its cause. This is why Kaycoot became so controversial despite its lack of extravagance. It represented a new kind of elite space, one that did not seek approval, only endurance. Unlike the ballrooms of Newport or the theatrical excess of Hearst Castle, Kaycoot offered no myth of shared culture. There were no legendary parties, no glamorous social narratives, no moments of public intimacy. The house did not tell stories. It kept them. Inside, life was ordered, quiet, and hierarchical. Decisions flowed downward. Access was controlled. The estate functioned like a corporate headquarters disguised as a residence. And that resemblance was not lost on critics. Kaikud felt less like a home and more like an extension of Standard Oil's organizational logic, centralized, insulated, and immune to external pressure. In the public imagination, this turned the house into a symbol of avoidance. While families mourned Ludlow, while labor movements demanded reform, Rockefeller power appeared to retreat into landscapes curated for permanence and calm. The contrast was devastating. What angered Americans was not simply that the Rockefellers lived well. It was that their wealth seemed untouched by consequence. The house still stood pristine. The gardens still bloomed. Life inside appeared uninterrupted. And that continuity suggested indifference, whether intended or not. Even Rockefeller philanthropy, expanding rapidly during this period, failed to alter this perception. Universities were funded. Medical research advanced. Entire institutions bore the family name. But the house remained closed. And that closure mattered more than generosity. To many Americans, Kaikud symbolized a refusal to participate in moral reckoning. It was a place where problems were solved administratively rather than emotionally, where tragedy was processed through committees, advisors, and distance. This perception hardened over time. The longer Kaikud remained insulated, the more it seemed to confirm the public suspicion that Rockefeller wealth was fundamentally incompatible with democratic transparency. The house did not adapt to public sentiment. It outlasted it. And that endurance became its most unsettling quality. Section 5 also exposes a deeper irony. Kaikud was designed to protect the family from chaos, yet it trapped them within a narrative they could no longer control. The very distance meant to preserve stability made reconciliation impossible. The Rockefellers could not meet the nation halfway, because the house itself had been built to prevent exactly that. As generations passed, Kaikud became less a residence and more a monument to withdrawal. Younger Rockefellers lived there only briefly or not at all. The house no longer functioned as a living home. It functioned as an idea, a physical reminder of a moment when wealth chose insulation over integration. And America noticed, unlike other Gilded Age mansions that eventually softened into nostalgic relics, Rockefeller estates never inspired longing. There was nothing to romanticize. No lost glamour. No vanished social world. The house had always been closed, and so it remained emotionally inaccessible. This is why America did not simply move on from Rockefeller mansions. It learned from them. They became cautionary symbols rather than cultural treasures. Proof that wealth, when detached from public life, corrodes trust rather than earning it. By the mid-20th century, Kaikud's meaning had shifted again. It was no longer actively hated, but it was never embraced. It existed in a liminal space, respected, preserved, but emotionally neutralized. The nation chose containment over confrontation. Section 5 ends with this realization. Rockefeller mansions were not rejected because they failed. They were rejected because they succeeded too well at what they were designed to do. They protected power. And in doing so, they revealed a truth Americans could not unsee, that when wealth builds walls high enough, it eventually walls itself off from legitimacy. From this point forward, the fate of Rockefeller mansions was sealed. They would survive physically, but never culturally. They would stand, but they would not belong. And in a nation that defines itself by participation, that quiet exile is the harshest verdict of all. By the time America entered the 1920s, the Rockefeller mansions no longer represented triumph. They represented endurance under suspicion. Section 6 explores what happened when public anger cooled but distrust hardened, when outrage gave way not to forgiveness, but to something colder and more permanent, moral distancing. This was the era when America did not storm Rockefeller gates anymore. It simply stopped caring what happened behind them. The First World War changed the country's emotional landscape. Sacrifice became collective. Death became statistical. Millions of ordinary Americans sent sons overseas and buried them without ceremony or compensation. Against that backdrop, the grievances of the Gilded Age were not forgotten, but they were reframed. The Rockefeller name no longer dominated headlines as a villain. Instead, it faded into a quieter category, untouchable power. And untouchable power does not inspire revolt. It inspires resignation. This shift was devastating for the symbolic life of Rockefeller estates. Public resentment is loud, but indifference is lethal. Mansions survive culturally only when they are woven into shared memory, admired, hated, romanticized, or mythologized. Rockefeller houses slipped into none of those roles. They became invisible in plain sight. Vast, permanent, and emotionally irrelevant. Unlike Vanderbilt or Astor estates, Rockefeller properties did not transition into public fantasy. There were no legends of glittering balls, no stories of reckless excess that could be repackaged as nostalgic entertainment. The Rockefellers had always been careful. That caution, once admired, now worked against them. There was nothing for the public to mourn or miss. At the same time, American attitudes toward wealth were evolving. The 1920s celebrated consumption, not accumulation. The new heroes were movie stars, athletes, and self-made businessmen who spent visibly and extravagantly. Wealth was expected to perform. Rockefeller wealth did not. It hid, reinvested, donated quietly, and remained structurally dominant without spectacle. This made Rockefeller mansions feel outdated even while they remained perfectly maintained. They belonged to an older philosophy of power, one rooted in control rather than charisma. And America was no longer interested in that model. The mansions themselves became strangely anachronistic. They were too large for modern family life, too private for public engagement, and too symbolically burdened to be celebrated. Maintaining them required resources that even the Rockefellers increasingly questioned. Not because they lacked money, but because the houses no longer justified their own existence. This is where the psychological cost of isolation becomes visible. Inside these estates, daily life grew quieter. Rooms went unused. Staff numbers were reduced. Entire wings were closed. The houses still stood in perfect condition, but they were no longer lived in fully. They became shells, beautiful, functional, and hollow. For the Rockefellers, this was not a financial problem. It was a narrative one. They had won every material battle and lost the cultural war. Philanthropy expanded dramatically during this period. Foundations grew. Universities, museums, medical institutions, and research centers flourished under Rockefeller funding. Yet none of this softened the perception of the mansions themselves. If anything, it sharpened the contrast. The family was willing to fund public goods, but not to open private spaces. They gave money, not presents, and Americans noticed the difference. In the popular imagination, Rockefeller wealth became abstract. It existed in endowments, grants, and institutions, not in lived human experience. You could attend a Rockefeller-funded university, but you would never set foot in a Rockefeller home. That separation mattered. It reinforced the idea that this wealth belonged to a different moral category, useful, but unreachable. As a result, Rockefeller mansions stopped functioning as symbols of aspiration. No one dreamed of living like the Rockefellers anymore. They dreamed of being entertainers, innovators, or industrial disruptors. Rockefeller life looked static by comparison, even sterile. This cultural shift explains why, when the Great Depression arrived, Rockefeller estates did not provoke renewed outrage. They provoked silence. During a time when millions lost homes, jobs, and savings, Rockefeller properties remained untouched. But instead of igniting fury, this permanence underscored a deeper truth Americans had already accepted. Some systems were beyond consequence. The mansions became monuments to that realization. They were not attacked, because people no longer believed attack would change anything. This resignation marked the final break between Rockefeller houses and the American emotional landscape. Once, these estates had embodied ambition. Then they embodied injustice. Now they embodied inevitability. And inevitability is not dramatic. It is numbing. Even within the family, attitudes shifted. Younger Rockefellers increasingly preferred urban apartments or modern residences. The mansions felt heavy with inherited meaning. They carried moral weight that could not be escaped by renovation or redecoration. To live there was to live inside unresolved history. As decades passed, the question of what to do with these properties became unavoidable. They were too significant to destroy, too compromised to celebrate, and too expensive to justify privately. The solution would be preservation, but preservation stripped of intimacy. When Rockefeller estates eventually opened to the public, they did so not as homes but as artifacts. Carefully framed, curated, sanitized. Visitors walked through rooms without ever feeling invited into a life. The houses told architectural stories, not human ones, and that, ultimately, is why America turned on Rockefeller mansions without ever touching them. They ceased to function as bridges between wealth and society. They became vaults storing power, memory, and unresolved tension behind walls too thick for empathy to penetrate. Section 6 ends here. At the moment when rejection becomes permanent, not through anger, but through emotional disengagement. The Rockefeller mansions survived every external threat, yet failed the one test that no amount of money can pass. They stopped mattering to the people, whose nation made them possible. From this point forward, the fate of these houses would be decided not by conflict, but by quiet administrative choices, donations, trusts, museums, foundations. The houses would remain. The power would remain. But the connection would not. And in that silence, the story of Rockefeller mansions reaches its most revealing chapter. By the mid-20th century, the Rockefeller mansions entered a strange afterlife. Section 7 examines the moment when these houses were no longer defended, attacked, or debated, but quietly reclassified. They were absorbed into America's institutional memory, stripped of emotional charge, and converted into something safer: heritage. This transformation did not redeem them. It neutralized them. The shift begins not with public announcement, but with paperwork. Trusts are formed. Boards are assembled. Legal language replaces family language. The mansions, once living centers of power, are slowly removed from the category of home and placed into the category of asset. This bureaucratic metamorphosis is critical. It signals that even the Rockefellers themselves no longer view these estates as places where life unfolds. They are now objects to be managed. This transition reflects a broader realization within the family. The houses cannot be made innocent. No renovation, no reinterpretation, no guided tour can erase the associations Americans have already formed. The only viable strategy is containment. Preserve the structures, control the narrative, and drain them of controversy through time and distance. So the mansions are opened, but not opened fully. Visitors are allowed to walk through curated paths, accompanied by carefully worded explanations. Rooms are frozen at idealized moments. Furniture is positioned not as it was lived with, but as it photographs well. The result is a version of history that feels intact, but emotionally hollow. What disappears in this process is tension, the struggle between labor and capital, the ethical contradictions of monopoly wealth, the human cost embedded in every stone. These are softened into abstract themes. The houses become lessons in architecture, landscape design, and philanthropy. They are no longer spaces of moral confrontation. This is not accidental. It is deliberate. By reframing Rockefeller mansions as cultural institutions rather than personal domains, the family accomplishes what public relations could never fully achieve. They remove the houses from the present. Once something belongs to history, it stops demanding accountability. It can be admired without agreement, preserved without endorsement, but something crucial is lost in that conversion. Museums invite observation, not identification. You can stand inside a Rockefeller mansion and still feel nothing. That emotional neutrality is the final verdict America passes on these spaces. Not hatred, not admiration, detachment. Contrast this with other Gilded Age estates that have found second lives as romanticized ruins or nostalgic symbols. Rockefeller mansions never acquire that glow. There is no collective longing for their world, no cultural desire to return to it even imaginatively. They are respected, but not loved. This emotional flatness reveals a deeper truth about how America processes power. Wealth can be forgiven. Even excess can be mythologized. But control is systemic. Unyielding control resists redemption. Rockefeller mansions represent control perfected and therefore unrelatable. Inside these houses, everything functioned exactly as intended. That is precisely the problem. American culture, rooted in reinvention and volatility, mistrusts spaces that appear immune to change. Rockefeller estates were designed to endure across generations, untouched by public sentiment or economic turbulence. When they succeeded, the success itself became alienating. Even as museums, the houses remain rigid. They do not evolve with visitors. They do not invite reinterpretation. They present a finished narrative, already resolved. That closure denies the audience a role in meaning-making. As a result, Rockefeller mansions occupy a unique position in American memory. They are not warnings, not inspirations, not tragedies. They are case studies, examined, catalogued, and filed away. Section 7 also addresses the generational fracture within the Rockefeller family itself. Later generations increasingly distanced themselves from the physical symbols of their inheritance. They engaged through foundations, boards, and global initiatives, not through ancestral homes. The mansions became obligations rather than anchors. This distancing reinforces the public perception that Rockefeller power no longer resides in places. It resides in systems. And systems do not need houses. By the late 20th century, the mansions functioned primarily as evidence of how wealth once organized itself spatially, architecturally, psychologically. They are artifacts of a worldview that no longer requires walls or land to operate. Power has gone portable. This evolution further diminishes the house's relevance. In an era of financial abstraction, the physical presence of a mansion feels almost quaint. The Rockefellers themselves have moved on, and America senses it. The mansions are left behind, preserved but orphaned. Visitors walk through immaculate rooms and feel no envy, no anger, no aspiration, only curiosity. The houses answer questions no one is emotionally invested in anymore. And that is their final function. Section 7 ends with this realization. Rockefeller mansions did not fall. They dissolved. They dissolved into archives, guided tours, and historical plaques. Their power drained away not through force, but through irrelevance. America did not destroy them because it no longer needed to. The houses stand precisely because they no longer threaten. And in that quiet survival lies the ultimate irony. The most carefully protected homes in American history became empty, not because they were breached, but because the world moved past the kind of power they were built to contain. What remains is stone, silence, and a lesson America absorbed, without ever needing to say aloud. The Rockefeller mansions are still there, but the country that once argued about them is gone. By the time the Rockefeller mansions had been neutralized into heritage sites and administrative assets, America had entered a new phase of self-examination. Section 8 explores how these houses, once symbols of dominance and later symbols of withdrawal, became reference points in a broader cultural reckoning about inequality, legitimacy, and the limits of private power. The mansions no longer provoked outrage, but they began to function as silent evidence in a trial that had already been decided. In the late 20th and early 21st centuries, America's relationship with wealth grew more complex and more anxious. Inequality widened again. Corporate power consolidated. New fortunes emerged in technology, finance, and global logistics. Yet something fundamental had changed since the age of Rockefeller. The new elites did not build monuments. They built platforms. They did not invest in permanence. They invested in speed. Against this backdrop, Rockefeller mansions looked almost archaic. Their stone walls and manicured grounds belonged to a world where power believed it needed a physical center. Modern wealth had learned a different lesson. Visibility creates vulnerability. Mobility creates safety. This contrast reframed how Americans interpreted Rockefeller estates. No longer seen simply as relics of excess or arrogance, They became early warnings, proof of what happens when power anchors itself too visibly in one place. The mansions were not just historical artifacts. They were cautionary diagrams. In public discourse, references to Rockefeller wealth increasingly omitted the houses altogether. The focus shifted to trusts, foundations, voting shares, and governance structures. Power was understood as abstract, legal, and global. The mansions, once central to the story, now appeared almost irrelevant to how influence actually functioned, and yet they remained standing. This physical persistence gave them a new role. They became anchors for memory in a culture increasingly detached from its material past. Visitors did not come seeking glamour or aspiration. They came seeking explanation. How did wealth once justify itself? How did it organize space, labor, and silence? How did it imagine its own permanence? The answers were embedded in these houses. Rockefeller mansions revealed a philosophy of control that modern America had not fully escaped, only redesigned. The separation between private decision-making and public consequence. The insulation of authority from emotional accountability. The belief that order could substitute for consent. These houses made that philosophy visible. This is why, during periods of renewed debate about inequality, Rockefeller mansions quietly re-entered conversations not as villains but as precedents. Journalists, historians, and critics pointed to them as early expressions of a problem that had never been solved, only deferred. They asked uncomfortable questions. What does responsible wealth look like? Can philanthropy compensate for structural dominance? Does preservation sanitize injustice or preserve its memory? The mansions offered no answers. But their continued existence forced the questions to remain. Importantly, America did not turn these houses into shrines of condemnation. There are no plaques denouncing monopoly abuses, no exhibits centered on labor violence, no immersive confrontations with the darker chapters of Rockefeller history. The absence is telling. The nation chose ambiguity over judgment. This choice reflects a deeper American tension. Condemning Rockefeller wealth too forcefully would require confronting the systems that replaced it. The mansions are safer targets than the mechanisms of modern capitalism. Yet even they are treated gently. As a result, Rockefeller estates exist in a moral gray zone. They are preserved but not celebrated, contextualized but not interrogated deeply. This restraint mirrors America's broader discomfort with examining power structures that still benefit it. The mansions survive because they are quiet. They do not demand attention. They do not provoke scandal. They simply endure, offering space for reflection without forcing conclusions. In a polarized culture, that neutrality is almost strategic. Section 8 also explores how public access itself changes meaning over time. When Rockefeller houses opened to visitors, it was framed as transparency. But transparency without vulnerability is incomplete. Seeing a space does not equate to understanding the forces that shaped it. Visitors walk through immaculate rooms, guided by narratives of taste, discipline, and philanthropy. The violence, exploitation, and coercion that fueled the fortune remain peripheral. The house becomes a lens that sharpens aesthetics while blurring ethics. This selective clarity allows America to maintain a comfortable distance from its own contradictions. The Rockefeller mansions thus become mirrors, reflecting not the family's values, but the nation's. What is emphasized? What is omitted? What is preserved? What is left unsaid? In this way, the houses are no longer about the Rockefellers at all. They are about America's evolving relationship with power, its reluctance to fully confront it, its tendency to aestheticize it, and its habit of moving forward without resolution. The mansions endure because they fit this pattern perfectly. They are impressive enough to merit preservation, restrained enough to avoid provocation, and distant enough to prevent identification. They sit comfortably within a culture that prefers complexity without consequence. As new generations encounter these estates, their reactions are muted. There is curiosity, not awe. Interest, not anger. The houses do not inspire rebellion or reverence. They inspire analysis. And analysis is safe. Section 8 concludes with a quiet but unsettling observation. Rockefeller mansions outlived the age that created them, not because they adapted, but because America adapted around them. The nation learned how to absorb symbols of extreme power without being destabilized by them. The houses no longer threaten democratic ideals because they have been rendered symbolic rather than operational. They stand as reminders of a past concentration of power. While the present version operates elsewhere, less visibly in that sense. The Rockefeller mansions achieved an afterlife more durable than relevance. They became educational tools, not emotional ones. And in doing so, they reveal the final stage of America's turning, not rejection, not acceptance, but integration without intimacy. The mansions are part of the landscape, now seen, known, and quietly set aside. As the Rockefeller mansions settled into their long, quiet afterlife, America's gaze shifted once more, this time not toward the houses themselves, but toward the absence they represented. Section 9 explores how these estates became markers of something that no longer existed, a visible, centralized elite willing to be seen. The mansions began to signify not power's presence, but its disappearance from the physical world. In the early 21st century, wealth reached levels that rivaled and in many cases exceeded the fortunes of the Gilded Age. Yet the architecture of that wealth looked nothing like the stone citadels of the Rockefellers. There were no equivalents to Kaikut or Pocantico hills rising to dominate landscapes. The new elite lived behind layers of anonymity, corporate structures, and geographic dispersion. Power no longer announced itself in marble and iron. It whispered through algorithms and contracts. This absence reshaped how Americans interpreted the Rockefeller mansions. They became the last monuments of an era when wealth still believed in spectacle. Standing before these estates, visitors sensed not intimidation, but nostalgia for a time when power could be confronted directly, even if only symbolically. You could stand outside it. Rockefeller Gate and nowhere. Authority resided. That clarity is gone. Section 9 argues that this loss of visibility changed the emotional relationship between citizens and power. When wealth is abstract, it becomes harder to challenge, harder to humanize, harder to hold accountable. The Rockefeller mansions, in contrast, remain stubbornly human in scale and intention. They were built by people who wanted to be remembered, even if they did not want to be understood. This human imprint is why the mansions still draw interest long after their political relevance faded. They offer a tangible vocabulary for discussing dominance, hierarchy, and insulation. You can walk their grounds and feel the spatial logic of separation, elevation, distance, controlled access. Modern power offers no such map. As inequality debates intensified in the 2010s and beyond, commentators increasingly referenced the Gilded Age as a comparative framework. Rockefeller mansions appeared in these discussions as visual shorthand for excess, but the comparison often stalled there. Unable to bridge the gap between architectural wealth and digital capital, the mansions became metaphors without equivalents. This mismatch created a strange inversion. Rockefeller estates, once criticized as obscene, now felt almost transparent. Their mechanisms of exclusion were visible and finite. Modern systems of power, by contrast, felt diffuse and inescapable. The houses did not become admirable. They became legible. Section 9 examines how this legibility altered public judgment. It is easier to critique something you can see. It is easier to imagine reforming power that occupies a place. The Rockefeller mansions, by remaining intact, inadvertently highlighted how inaccessible modern wealth had become. In this way, the estates acquired a new moral dimension, not because they changed, but because everything else did. The mansions also served as endpoints for a cultural arc. They represented the moment when American wealth last believed permanence required place. After the Rockefellers, power learned to migrate. It shed architecture. It became adaptable, evasive, and global. The houses were left behind as fossils of an older strategy. Section 9 also explores the emotional response this realization produces. There is a faint sense of relief that such overwhelming physical dominance is no longer common. But there is also unease. If power no longer needs walls, Where does it reside? And how can it be confronted? The Rockefeller mansions, frozen in time, cannot answer these questions. But their silence amplifies them. Visitors often report an unexpected feeling when touring these estates, not resentment, not admiration, but melancholy. The sadness does not come from sympathy for the wealthy. It comes from recognizing that even the most visible expressions of power eventually lose their relevance. While the structures behind them persist, the houses remind us that symbols can be dismantled without dismantling systems. This realization reframes America's turning away from Rockefeller mansions. It was not a moral victory. It was a shift in focus. The nation stopped arguing with these buildings because the argument had moved elsewhere. Section 9 emphasizes that forgetting is not the same as resolving. The mansions stand as unresolved punctuation marks in American history. They mark where one chapter ended, not because it was completed, but because a new, more complex chapter began. The estates are still there, impeccably maintained, patiently awaiting interpretations that no longer quite fit. They are monuments to a form of power that made itself known, and in doing so, made itself vulnerable. Modern power learned from that mistake. This is why Rockefeller mansions feel strangely harmless today. They have been outpaced, outgrown, their dominance replaced by networks that cannot be toured or photographed. Yet their continued presence performs a quiet service. They remind us that power once had a face, an address, a gate you could stand before and refuse to enter. That clarity is gone, and its absence weighs heavily on democratic imagination. Section 9 concludes by suggesting that the true reason America turned away from Rockefeller mansions is not because they were too powerful, but because they were too honest. They revealed their scale, their ambition, and their confidence openly. In an age where power prefers obscurity, such openness feels almost anachronistic. The houses endure as evidence of a moment when wealth still believed it could stand still and be judged. It can no longer afford that confidence. And so the Rockefeller mansions remain visible, static, and strangely innocent, while the real centers of power move unseen, unchallenged. And UNVISIT that the nation did not defeat the houses. It simply learned to look elsewhere. In the final section, the story returns not to the Rockefellers, but to the country that watched them rise, recoil, and quietly recede from view. Section 10 examines what remains after the mansions have been absorbed into landscape and memory, and what America's long turning away ultimately reveals about itself. This is not an ending about buildings. It is an ending about how a nation learns to live with power it cannot fully confront or fully forget. By now, Rockefeller mansions occupy a peculiar position in American consciousness. They are present but not persuasive, known but not influential. They exist in guidebooks, archives, and weekend itineraries, yet they no longer shape how Americans think about wealth in real time. Their physical survival contrasts sharply with their cultural irrelevance. And that contrast is the conclusion. America did not dismantle Rockefeller power through moral reckoning alone, nor did it reconcile with it through admiration. Instead, the nation performed something subtler and more enduring. It redefined the terms of legitimacy. The mansions lost their authority not because they were exposed as unjust, but because they no longer aligned with how power needed to operate. In earlier sections, the houses appeared as threats, symbols, fossils, and mirrors. In this final phase, they become boundaries, markers of where one form of American ambition ends. The Rockefellers built as if permanence were proof of righteousness. America ultimately rejected that logic. The rejection was quiet. No mass movements marched on the estates. No laws demanded their demolition. No cultural purge erased their names. Instead, time performed the work that outrage could not. The houses were preserved, catalogued, and rendered inert. They became safe. This safety is often mistaken for forgiveness. But Section 10 argues that it is something else entirely. Safety is neutrality, and neutrality is the most effective. Where culture withdraws belief. America stopped believing in the moral authority of monumental wealth. This shift explains Why later generations of elites avoided replicating Rockefeller architecture. They learned that grandeur invites scrutiny, and scrutiny invites resistance. Better to disperse. Better to remain abstract. Better to leave no single place for public imagination to gather. Rockefeller mansions thus marked the end of an architectural philosophy of power. They were the last attempt to assert legitimacy through scale, order, and visibility. Everything that followed learned to hide as a result. These houses now feel like artifacts from a lost language, one America no longer speaks fluently. Visitors admire craftsmanship without internalizing ideology. They note symmetry without absorbing intent. The message has faded, even if the medium remains intact. This fading is America's verdict. The nation did not need to condemn the Rockefellers explicitly. It only needed to move on to systems that no longer required justification through stone. Section 10 also confronts the uncomfortable truth that America's turning away was incomplete. The mansions lost symbolic power, but the mechanisms of influence they represented did not vanish. They evolved. The concentration of wealth continued. The separation between decision-makers and consequences persisted. What changed was visibility. Rockefeller mansions once allowed Americans to locate power geographically. You could point to a hill, a gate, a skyline, and say, "It is there." That clarity enabled critique, satire, protest, and myth-making. When power dissolved into networks, that clarity disappeared. The houses remain as reminders of what has been lost, not fairness. But legibility. This loss complicates any romantic reading of America's rejection. The nation did not replace Rockefeller dominance with transparency or equality. It replaced it with complexity. Power became harder to trace, harder to challenge, and harder to imagine confronting at all. In this sense, Rockefeller mansions now serve a paradoxical function. They stand as visible symbols of an invisible problem. They are the last places where Americans can physically experience the scale of elite insulation. You can walk through their rooms and understand separation. You cannot walk through a hedge fund. Section 10 emphasizes that this is why these houses continue to matter, even in irrelevance. They provide a tactile reference point for conversations that otherwise drift into abstraction. They anchor debates about inequality in something you can see, touch, and enter, but they do so without resolution. There is no final moral carved into their stone. No lesson clearly stated. The houses do not instruct. They endure. And endurance itself becomes the message. America lives comfortably among the remnants of power it no longer believes in. While negotiating with new forms, it has not yet learned to question. The Rockefeller mansions survive because they ask nothing of the present. They demand no allegiance, provoke no fear, and inspire no imitation. They simply exist, suspended between condemnation and nostalgia. That suspension is America's compromise. Section 10 concludes by returning to a simple but unsettling observation. When the Rockefellers built their mansions, they believed history would validate them. When America turned away, it did not invalidate them either. It archived them. Archiving is not justice. It is management. The houses were managed into silence, and in that silence, they tell the most honest story of all, not about a family, but about a nation that learned how to coexist with extreme power without ever fully resolving its presence. The Rockefeller mansions still stand on hills and behind gates, meticulously preserved, carefully interpreted, emotionally distant. They are no longer warnings or aspirations. They are reminders of a moment when power believed it could be seen and survive. Judgment. America proved otherwise. The country did not destroy these houses because it did not need to. It learned that power could be outgrown symbolically even as it persisted structurally. The mansions lost their voice, and that loss was enough. In the end, America did not turn on the Rockefeller mansions in anger. It turned away, and that quiet turning, patient, collective, irreversible, is how nations end conversations they are not ready to finish, but no longer willing to continue. The houses remain. The belief that built them does not. That is the final legacy of the Rockefeller mansions. Not ruin, not redemption, but disappearance in plain sight.